1936 heralded the rise of one of the 20th century's most insidious secrets, Unit 731. Hidden in the heart of Manchuria, this covert division of the Imperial Japanese Army became an industrial factory of inhumane human experimentation. Thousands of men, women, and children were subjected to unspeakable horrors in the name of science. In this video, we will uncover the history of Unit 731, a secretive Japanese military research unit operating between 1936 and 1945, infamous for conducting unethical experiments on unwilling test subjects. Located in Japanese-occupied northern China, its aim was to produce biological weapons capable of bringing China to its knees. In the early 1930s, Japan embarked on an aggressive campaign to expand its empire, targeting resource-rich Manchuria in northeastern China. This marked the beginning of a bloody occupation and the establishment of a puppet state, Manchukuo, under Japan's control. The occupation was brutal, with over 100,000 believed to have died. Unit 731, referred to as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, was founded in 1936 under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a physician and bacteriologist stationed in Harbin, Manchuria. The unit's alleged purpose was to prevent the spread of disease and conduct medical research. However, its true objective was far more sinister. As Japan's war with China intensified following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, Unit 731 ramped up its operations, conducting inhumane experiments on Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and individuals from other occupied territories. These experiments aimed to develop biological weapons, understand the effects of extreme conditions on the human body, and harvesting and testing on human organs. Protected by Japan's thirst for a colonial empire and its culture of military obedience, Unit 731 carried out its operations with impunity. The Japanese occupation of Manchuria gave them free rein to experiment at will, far from any active battlefield. The Japanese occupation of Manchuria began in 1931, following the Mukden incident, a staged sabotage of a Japanese railway line near Mukden. Japan blamed Chinese dissidents for the attack, using it as a pretext to invade the region. Within months, Japanese forces seized Manchuria, a resource-rich area critical to Japan's imperial ambitions. In 1932, Japan established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing Puyi, the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty, as its figurehead ruler. However, real power rested with Japanese officials and the military, the Kwantung Army, who even the Japanese government could not control. While Japan portrayed Manchukuo as a colonial experiment in state building, the reality of life for the native Chinese population was one of exploitation and repression. The League of Nations demanded the area be returned to the Chinese government, but this only resulted in Japan leaving the League. Manchukuo was integral to Japan's war efforts, providing massive amounts of natural resources which were often scarce in Japan. Japan heavily exploited the region's resources, including the local population, who faced forced labor in violent and dangerous conditions. The occupation also facilitated covert operations like Unit 731's experiments, conducted under the guise of scientific research. Manchukuo became a testing ground for Japan's military strategies and biological warfare programs. Unit 731 conducted a series of horrifying experiments to study the limits of human endurance and the effects of extreme environmental conditions, such as pressure, heat, and radiation. Pressure experiments were carried out to examine how the human body reacts to changes in atmospheric pressure. Prisoners were placed in sealed chambers where the pressure could be gradually increased or decreased. These experiments often resulted in the rupture of internal organs, such as lungs and eardrums, causing excruciating pain and death. Researchers meticulously recorded the effects, treating the victims as disposable test subjects in their pursuit of data for high-altitude flight and submarine operations. X-ray radiation studies were designed to investigate the effects of prolonged radiation exposure. Prisoners were subjected to repeated X-ray exposure, often to the point of severe burns, organ failure, or death. The experiments aimed to study radiation's potential as a sterilization tool. Such high exposure to radiation caused irreversible harm, including cancer, radiation sickness, and untimely deaths among the victims. Dehydration tests explored the effects of extreme water deprivation. Prisoners were denied all fluids and subjected to conditions that accelerated dehydration, such as exposure to heat. Researchers monitored the physical and mental deterioration, often forcing the subjects to endure this torment until death. The data gathered was used to study survival conditions for soldiers in arid environments. Centrifuge experiments involved spinning prisoners at high speeds to test the effects of extreme gravitational forces on the human body. These tests often led to the rupture of blood vessels, brain damage, and death. Researchers hoped to use this knowledge to understand the impact of rapid acceleration and deceleration on fighter pilots. Unit 731's experiments stand as some of the most horrific examples of human cruelty in the name of scientific advancement. The facility became a hub for biological and chemical warfare research. Prisoners, referred to as marutas, meaning logs, were used as unwilling subjects, and the experiments conducted on them were brutal, inhumane, and usually fatal. One of the primary focuses of Unit 731 was the study and weaponization of infectious diseases. Prisoners were deliberately infected with pathogens such as anthrax, glanders, and even the bubonic plague. Researchers closely observed the progression of these diseases, noting how symptoms manifested and how long it took for the victim to succumb. Multiple attacks were launched on China based on the work of Unit 731. In one instance, the Japanese Air Force continuously dropped cotton, sand, and grain infected with the bubonic plague on the city of Ningbo. The attack targeted Chinese civilians exclusively. Eventually, there was a serious outbreak of plague. The Chinese authorities walled off the infected area to quarantine those who had caught the disease. Over 100 people died, and the quarantine area was eventually burnt to the ground. Delivery systems for biological weapons were also extensively tested. Bombs filled with plague-infested fleas or anthrax spores were dropped on prisoners or even live Chinese villages. 731 sought the most effective way to spread disease and tested many different methods. These included infected crops, ceramic bombs, and fabric balloons. Biological warfare field tests extended beyond controlled environments. In addition to bombings, wells were contaminated and aircraft distributed the bacteria in aerosol form. Japanese forces in Nanking even injected bread rolls with typhoid, which were then given to Chinese prisoners of war. The methods of Unit 731 were devoid of medical ethics or humanity, treating prisoners as disposable tools. The death toll from the experiments and biological attacks is largely unknown, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to 250,000, though the exact numbers may never be known. General Shiro Ishii, the mastermind behind Unit 731, was a physician and microbiologist whose name became synonymous with one of history's most grotesque episodes of wartime experimentation. Born in 1892 in Japan, Ishii showed early promise in the medical field, eventually earning a medical degree from Kyoto Imperial University. His interest in bacteriology and public health led to his appointment in the Japanese Army's Medical Corps, where his ambitions began to take shape. Ishii was a fervent proponent of biological warfare, believing it to be the future of military strategy. He advocated for the development of biological weapons that could devastate enemy populations while sparing infrastructure. In the 1930s, Ishii conducted research tours across Europe and America, studying advances in microbiology and methods of warfare. Upon returning to Japan, he convinced military leaders to establish a program for biological weapons development, which culminated in the creation of Unit 731 in Manchuria. Under Ishii's command, Unit 731 became a hub of inhumane experimentation. Ishii was both an organizer and a direct participant in the atrocities, overseeing experiments on prisoners involving infectious diseases, vivisection, the removal of organs from a living human, and weapons testing. His authoritarian leadership style enabled him to foster a culture of absolute secrecy and loyalty among his subordinates. Yoshimura Hisato was a Japanese physiologist and physician who became infamous for his role in the inhumane experiments conducted at Unit 731 during World War II. A professor at Kyoto Imperial University before joining the military, Yoshimura specialized in the study of extreme environmental conditions on the human body. His research took a horrifying turn when he became a key figure in Unit 731's experimental programs in Manchuria. At Unit 731, Yoshimura conducted cruel and lethal experiments on prisoners, many of whom were Chinese civilians, political dissidents, or captured Allied soldiers. He was particularly infamous for his frostbite experiments, which were designed to study the effects of extreme cold on human physiology and to develop methods for treating frostbite. Prisoners were forced to stand outdoors in freezing temperatures until their limbs froze solid. Yoshimura then subjected the frozen limbs to various methods of thawing, such as immersing them in warm water or applying heat directly. These experiments caused excruciating pain, irreversible damage to tissues, and often death. Yoshimura's goal was to understand the limits of human endurance and survival, data he believed could benefit the Japanese military. However, these studies were conducted without anesthesia, informed consent, or any regard for the suffering inflicted. As the war in Europe had ended and the war in the Pacific was nearing its end, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Soviet forces quickly overpowered the Kwantung and what remained of the regular Japanese army, quickly making their way through the now collapsing Manchukuo. The unit's leadership scrambled to cover up their atrocities. Evidence of their horrific experiments was systematically destroyed, with documents, photographs, and research data burned or buried to prevent discovery by Allied forces. The remains of countless victims were dumped in mass graves, leaving few traces of the unit's crimes. The fall of Manchukuo and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945 hastened the collapse of Unit 731. Soviet forces advanced rapidly, seizing key Japanese territories, including Harbin, where Unit 731 was based. The Soviet capture of documents and evidence linked to the unit's activities posed a threat to the Japanese military's efforts to conceal their war crimes. In addition to destroying evidence, the Japanese military executed many of the prisoners who had survived the brutal experiments, ensuring that no one could testify to the atrocities that took place within the unit. The researchers and personnel involved in the operations were given orders to board a train home, to never contact each other, and never reveal the true nature of their work. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Ishii escaped prosecution by negotiating immunity with the United States in exchange for his research data. This controversial deal allowed him to live quietly until his death from throat cancer in 1959. Despite the brutality of his actions, Yoshimura Hisato, like many other Unit 731 personnel, evaded justice after the war. In exchange for their experimental data, the U.S. granted full immunity to Yoshimura and others involved. This controversial arrangement allowed him to return to academic life in Japan, where he continued his work at the Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine, eventually becoming its president. Dr. Ken Yuasa was another participant of Unit 731 and was responsible for the deaths of at least 14 Chinese prisoners. Rather than return to Japan, he instead joined the Kuomintang, the official army of the Republic of China, and fought with them in the Civil War against the Communist People's Liberation Army until 1949. His identity was discovered and he was investigated, but returned to Japan in 1956, where he openly revealed the secrets of his wartime activities. A group of 180 plaintiffs, the relatives of Unit 731's victims, brought a case to court in the early 2000s, seeking for Japan to admit to conducting biological attacks against China. Prior to this ruling, the Japanese government had consistently denied the existence of Unit 731 and the use of biological weapons. The judge agreed that the Japanese military had deliberately spread anthrax, bubonic plague, typhoid, and other diseases amongst the Chinese populace, going against both the Geneva and Hague Conventions. However, the plaintiffs' calls for compensation were rejected. For the duration of its existence, some historians estimate as many as 250,000 innocent Chinese civilians were victims of Japanese medical and biological experimentation. The crimes of Unit 731 are still very real for some, such as Hideo Shimizu, who served as a lab assistant. He kept his secret for 70 years until the burden became too much and he was forced to speak out. He sought forgiveness in front of a public audience at the former site of Unit 731. His apology was warmly welcomed in China, but at home in Japan, many are still unwilling to face up to their nation's past crimes.